Sils Maria, Switzerland, nearly 6,000 feet above sea level. Here, the air is so thin and so transparent that it feels as though you are breathing an invisible kind of light. The wind moves through the pine trees without noise. It only murmurs like an unbroken whisper, slow enough to stretch time, cold enough to sharpen every thought. In the late 19th century, evenings, a familiar figure was often seen along the mountain path, a gaunt man, walking alone, eyes slightly narrowed from pain, one hand gripping a small notebook as though it were a lifeline. He was not seeking fame, nor was he seeking comfort. He was searching for something far more dangerous, a form of power not seated on a throne, but rooted in the ability to redefine what human beings call right and wrong, noble and base. And perhaps, what you think you know about Friedrich Nietzsche may be wrong. He is often remembered through a few blazing phrases: God is dead, the Übermensch, the will to power. But if we stop at those slogans, we miss the most unsettling aspect of this story. Nietzsche left behind no church, no closed system, no party for you to shelter within. He did not want followers. He wanted you to step away from the crowd, to hear your own voice once all other voices have fallen silent. Some lives begin in the most ordinary way: a child in a devout family, a tidy home, shelves of theological books, a simple faith like a warm blanket. Then an event arrives: loss, illness, solitude, and time crushes the old shell. From that point of collapse, through one particular element, ruthless honesty with his own thoughts, Nietzsche gradually stepped onto a path that would shake the foundations of the West, not through outward violence, but through a hammer striking the idols in our minds, listening to hear whether they are hollow or solid. Welcome to deep sleep of power, where we slow our breathing and let history speak in a lower voice. If you find that, if stories like these help you relax and drift more easily into sleep, please support the channel with a like and a subscription. That small gesture helps other sleepless souls find their way here. And now, let us turn back time. Before Nietzsche stood upon cold mountain peaks and stared directly into the philosophical abyss, he was once a young boy in a small Prussian village, in a world that seemed safe. And it was there that the first shadow began to lengthen. If we wish to understand how far a thought can travel, we must listen carefully to where it begins. Not in noisy lecture halls, not amid sharp debates, but inside a small house where everything is so quiet that one can hear time breathing. Röcken was a small village in the region of Saxony, Prussia. In the mid-19th century, it seemed to exist outside the hurried current of history. Fields stretched outward, familiar dirt roads wound through the land, and life moved slowly and evenly, like a prayer repeated each day. At the center of this world stood the pastor's house, modest, orderly, and deeply permeated by the spirit of faith. Friedrich Nietzsche was born in that house in 1844. From the very beginning, the boy's world was wrapped in order. His father, Ludwig Nietzsche, was a Lutheran pastor, a gentle, learned man who believed deeply that life had meaning because it was firmly anchored in God. In that household, books were not merely objects to be read. They were part of the air itself. Bibles, theological works, pages dense with the scent of old paper, all of it formed the backdrop of Friedrich's childhood. The boy grew up under tender care, in a world where every question seemed to have an answer already prepared. Good and evil were clearly defined. Duty and faith walked side by side. Life in that early vision resembled a road already drawn. If one walked it correctly, one would be guided and protected. There was something profoundly crucial in this calm. It created a primal sense of safety, a first spiritual home. Later, when Nietzsche spoke of the courage required to leave behind the shelter of old values, he did not talk from emptiness. He said from the very real memory of having once lived beneath such a roof. In the rare moments when Nietzsche recalled his childhood, he remembered playing among his father's bookshelves. It was not a violent memory, but a gentle one. Gentle like the afternoon light slipping through a window. Frame, settling on wooden floors and printed pages. The boy was not forced to become a thinker. No one urged him to ask questions. Yet within that quiet, an observing mind had begun to form. A mind accustomed to listening, accustomed to being alone with its thoughts. The world of Röcken was not harsh, but it was serious. That seriousness planted in Friedrich a lifelong habit, respect for intellect, and the view that thinking itself was a moral responsibility. Here thought was not something to display, but something to live with. Yet every order, no matter how complete, is fragile, and sometimes it is precisely that fragility which determines a human fate. Death came to the Nietzsche family quietly, but it left behind a void that could not be filled. When the father died, the world of Röcken did not collapse immediately. The walls still stood, the books still rested on their shelves, but the invisible pillar was gone. For a child, losing a father is not merely the loss of a person, it is the loss of the final anchor of order. And what is striking is this: Nietzsche did not rebel at once. He did not revolt. He did not immediately doubt. He absorbed that loss in silence, like soil absorbing the first rain of the season. The unusual seriousness that many later observed in him was not innate. It was the response of a young mind forced to mature earlier than expected. Röcken thus became a paradox, both the first refuge and the place where the seeds of later rupture were sown. Precisely because he had once lived in a world where all values were specific, Nietzsche would later experience a profound shock when that world dissolved. One who has never believed will never feel loss when belief collapses. The world of Röcken taught Nietzsche the first and most important lesson, that human beings can live by faith. But it did not have time to teach him the second, that such faith can disappear. And then when the family was forced to leave Röcken, carrying memories and pain with them, another chapter began. A new city, a new environment, new relationships. Yet the shadow of Röcken, the shadow of a lost order, continued to follow the boy Friedrich, quietly and persistently. It was on that journey, elsewhere, among different people, that Nietzsche would for the first time discover something that could replace the old world: friendship, music, and a young intellectual community. And there, at Naumburg, a new door would open. Some losses do not arrive like a storm. They come quietly, like dew settling in the night. The next morning, when we open our eyes, the world is still there. Yet something has withdrawn forever. For a child, a father is not merely a person. He is the axis of order, the voice that gives the world meaning, the point upon which all questions ultimately come to rest. For Friedrich Nietzsche, his father's departure was not only a private sorrow. It was the first time he touched a truth that would later stand at the center of his entire philosophy. What we believe to be eternal can disappear without warning. Friedrich Nietzsche died after a prolonged illness. The sickness came slowly, but death was decisive. The pastor's house in Röcken no longer echoed with the warm cadence of sermons. The theological books were still there, but the one who could explain them, through voice and presence, was gone. In a single moment, the world secured by faith lost its guardian. And then, as if fate wished to carve the lesson more deeply, the tragedy did not end there. Not long after, Friedrich's infant brother, Joseph, also died. 2 deaths in succession did not merely take away 2 lives. They created a long and profound void, a void for which a child's memory has no words. The first shadow appears here. Not the shadow of fear, but the shadow of absence. The Nietzsche household now became a world almost entirely of women. Mother, sister, grandmother, and aunts. It was a world of devoted care, of quiet love, of rigorous morality. Yet no matter how loving it lacked what Friedrich had once known: a masculine model, a father, a vertical axis upon which a young mind could lean. Within that world, Friedrich grew unusually quiet, not because he thought little, but because he thought too much. Other children respond to grief with tears or rebellion. Friedrich responded with seriousness, as though he understood, without yet being able to express it, that from this point on, nothing was guaranteed. The family moved to Naumburg, beginning a new life. On the surface, it was a necessary fresh start, but inwardly the shadow of Röcken continued to follow Friedrich. It did not take on a clear form. It was simply there, in moments of silence, in the way he regarded the world as something to be observed carefully, never fully trusted. What is essential to recognize is this: Nietzsche did not lose his faith at this moment. He did not become a skeptic at the age of 8. But a seed had been planted, the seed of a quiet question. If the best, the most devout, can still be taken away, then what truly stands behind the order of this world? The first shadow did not weaken Nietzsche. It deepened him. It taught the boy a skill that would later become a philosophical weapon: the ability to live alongside questions without answers. In the years to come, Nietzsche would write about strength, about will, about the capacity to affirm life, even in the absence of metaphysical guarantees. But the roots of those ideas do not lie in books. They lie in this very early experience when a child was forced to learn how to stand firm in a world that had lost its center. The first shadow also taught Nietzsche about solitude. Not solitude as abandonment, but solitude as a mental state. He grew accustomed to being alone with his thoughts, accustomed to not sharing too quickly, accustomed to preserving silence as a necessary space for existence. And within that silence, another capacity began to take shape: the capacity for deep attachment when the opportunity arises. For those who experience loss early often yearn for something beyond the family: a spiritual community, a friendship capable of partially replacing the broken axis. Naumburg was not merely a new refuge. It was where the first threads of friendship began to form. And there, amid youthful relationships, amid the sound of the piano and naive conversations, Nietzsche would find a temporary escape from the shadow, an escape called music and friendship. But before that could happen, the shadow remained, quiet, patient. It did not crush him. It watched him grow. And it was precisely that shadow which would make the bonds soon to be formed in Naumburg especially significant. For when the old world has collapsed, human beings constantly seek a way to build a new one. After a significant loss, people often enter life with 2 possible paths. One is to close themselves off, like a door shut tightly, so the wind can no longer enter. The other is to open up, very slowly, very cautiously, in search of another form of warmth, one that cannot replace the past, but is enough to allow life to continue. Naumburg was where the Nietzsche family settled after leaving Röcken. The familiar pastor's house was gone, as were the fields and the rhythm of village life. Here, the world was broader, louder, filled with more sounds and more gazes. Cobblestone streets, dark-tiled roofs, small shops, orderly school hours. Everything seemed to tell the boy Friedrich that life went on. Yet within him, the first shadow remained. It was not an explosive pain. It was more like a thin layer of mist laid over every feeling, preventing joy from ever being complete, giving even laughter an edge of seriousness. And because of this, the adolescent Friedrich Nietzsche developed an unusual quality early on. He could be among others, yet still stand slightly apart, observing, listening, remembering. In this setting, the first form of salvation did not come from philosophy. It came from something softer, friendship. In Naumburg, Friedrich began his studies under the guidance of a young teacher named Weber. He displayed a rare focus, a kind of inner discipline, as though he feared that time might once again take something away. He learned quickly, wrote well, and read widely. But what caused him to begin opening up was not achievement. It was encounters. Wilhelm Pinder and Gustav Krug, two boys from respected families in the region, became the first friends with whom Friedrich could form a deep bond. Their friendship was not loud. It was built through long conversations, books passed from hand to hand, and questions that seemed childish, yet touched something profoundly real. Does the world have meaning? What is life for? Can beauty save human beings? When a child has tasted loss early, he does not seek friends to play with. He seeks friends to be understood. And perhaps Wilhelm and Gustav, with the openness of youth, gave Friedrich a rare feeling, the sense that his mind was not a locked room. It could be shared. Then music entered. For Nietzsche, music was not a hobby. It was a space, a place where emotions were allowed to exist without justification, where pain could flow through without needing to be named. During his years in Naumburg, Friedrich played the piano, composed minor melodies, and gradually realized something. Sometimes, what cannot be spoken in words can be spoken through sound. Imagine an evening in Naumburg, a warm room, soft yellow lamplight. Outside the window, cold wind moves across the rooftops. Inside, a boy sits at the piano. His fingers are still clumsy, yet full of resolve. Each note sounds like a gentle step, asking no one to understand, only to exist. Perhaps it was in moments like these that Friedrich learned the second lesson of his life. The first lesson was this: everything can disappear. The second was this: there are still things, fragile as they may be, that can hold us in place. Friendship, art, and the sense that beauty is not only something to admire, but something to live by. This is crucial if one wishes to understand Nietzsche later on. He is often remembered as a destroyer, a man wielding a hammer against idols. But Nietzsche did not begin with a hammer. He started with music. Music taught him that life is not only morality and duty, it is also rhythm, intensity, and sudden flashes of brightness. And one day, far in the future, when Nietzsche would meet Wagner, he would realize that what drew him was not philosophy alone, but the promise of a culture redeemed through art. That seed was planted in Naumburg. Friendship in Naumburg also taught Nietzsche something about power, but a subtler kind of power. The power of influence, not the power to command, but the power to expand another person's world. Wilhelm and Gustav opened a door for Friedrich, leading him out of the shadow of family and into a community of ideas. And within that community, Nietzsche began to form a habit: writing. Not merely writing assignments, but writing as a way of existing, writing as a way of holding on to things that life might otherwise take away. One can imagine the boy Friedrich after school hours, sitting alone with his notebook. He writes down small things, a line of poetry, a thought, a fragment of music. But beneath these small things lies a larger instinct, the instinct to turn experience into meaning. It is the instinct of a thinker. Naumburg, then, was not simply a gentle chapter. It was the chapter in which Nietzsche learned how to recreate life after loss, how to stand upright without the old pillar, how to find a new support within his own mind, within friendship, within art. But life, as we have seen, does not like to leave a soul at peace for too long. Just as Nietzsche began to feel that he had a new world, a sense of belonging, another door opened, a door leading to a far more demanding environment, a place where intellect would be forged like iron in fire, a place where mediocrity was not tolerated, a place where the boy Friedrich, carrying both shadow and music within him, would be tested to the limit. And that place was Schulpforta, a school that did not merely teach knowledge, it taught endurance, and sometimes it taught the art of silent rebellion. There are doors that once crossed no longer allow a person to remain who they once were, not because anyone forbids it, but because the new environment demands change, or leaves one behind. Schulpforta was such a place. This ancient boarding school stood apart from ordinary life, like a parallel world built exclusively for the intellect. Thick stone walls, long corridors echoing with steady footsteps, classrooms where discipline was sustained by habit rather than by the rod. Here, time did not move according to emotion. It moved according to study, according to rigid schedules, according to the uncompromising demands of excellence. When Friedrich Nietzsche arrived at Schulpforta in 1858, he was not yet 14 years old. For a boy from a modest pastor's family, this was more than an educational opportunity. It was a social displacement, a leap into another stratum of existence, where young minds were selected and forged to become the intellectual elite of Germany. But Schulpforta did not welcome its students with warmth. It tested them first. Days here began early. Lessons were long. Latin, ancient Greek, dense classical texts, everything demanded intense concentration and enduring stamina. For many students, Schulpforta was a burden. For Nietzsche, it was a mirror. In this environment, he realized that he was not merely intelligent, he was different. Not different in a loud or showy way, but in depth. While many classmates sought to master their lessons in order to achieve results, Nietzsche was drawn into the very structure of thought itself. He did not only want to know what had been written, but why human beings wrote as they did, why specific values had been regarded as self-evident for centuries. Schulpforta taught Nietzsche something crucial. Discipline is not necessarily the enemy of freedom. On the contrary, intellectual discipline gave him the tools to dig deeper into the questions he carried with him from Röcken and Naumburg. Yet at the same time, it planted a quiet unease within him, for he began to sense the tension between independent thinking and collective frameworks. Here, everything had a standard, everything had a measure, and Nietzsche, guided by instinct, soon recognized a paradox. A system designed to produce intellect could also inadvertently suffocate thoughts that did not fit its mold. He excelled academically, but not in an obedient way. Nietzsche's writings displayed a freedom of thought that teachers both admired and regarded with caution. He read beyond the curriculum. He asked questions that the curriculum did not answer. And more importantly, he began to form a habit that would stay with him for life, refusing to accept an idea simply because it had been handed down. Schulpforta was also where Nietzsche first experienced intellectual solitude in a profound way. Not solitude born of exclusion, but solitude born of the fact that few could follow him to the depths his thinking sought to reach. For an adolescent, this was an experience that both nourished and wounded. In the evenings at the dormitory, when conversation subsided, Nietzsche often remained alone with his books and private notes. No one forced him into this, but he seemed already to understand that if he wished to stay honest with his own thinking, he would have to accept the solitude that came with it. It was during this period that a silent rebellion began to take shape. Not a rebellion against teachers, not against discipline, but a rebellion against foundational assumptions, against things considered obviously true, simply because they had existed for long enough. The religious faith Nietzsche had grown up with did not vanish at once, but it began to crack, not because he encountered aggressive refutations, but because he started to realize that history, even the history of belief, is a chain of interpretations, not an unchanging truth. Schulpforta, therefore, was not merely a place that trained a scholar. It was the birthplace of a dangerous habit of thought, the habit of viewing all values as products of history rather than as gifts from eternity. But this awakening came at a cost. Nietzsche gradually grew distant from the official curriculum, not because he lacked ability, but because his intellectual energy was increasingly drawn into his own private reflections. When graduation examinations arrived in 1864, Nietzsche passed with barely sufficient marks, a paradoxical result for an extraordinary mind, yet entirely consistent with a spirit that had already begun to stray from the prescribed path. For his family, university was the obvious next step, and theology the expected choice. For Nietzsche, Schulpforta had accomplished something quiet yet decisive. It had taught him that following the expectations of others is a form of losing oneself. When the doors of Schulpforta closed behind him, Nietzsche did not leave as a model student. He went as a mind seething with unresolved questions, and those questions would not remain silent in the lecture halls of theology. For in the next stage, within university libraries among dust-covered pages, Nietzsche would encounter a teacher not present in flesh and blood, one who would give him the language to name the unease that had been growing within him. That man was Schopenhauer, and that encounter would change the entire direction of Nietzsche's life. There is a strange moment in every human life when we realize that the answers we were taught are no longer sufficient to shelter the questions quietly growing within us. That moment is not loud. It does not erupt. It arrives like a hairline crack, running across the surface of things once thought solid. And if we listen closely enough, we can hear that crack opening into a deeper space, where fate and history begin to whisper. For Friedrich Nietzsche, that moment came very early, not through a violent upheaval, not in the midst of a heated debate, but in the silence of a piece of writing, a youthful essay titled Fate and History. That essay was not a manifesto. It challenged no one directly, yet it posed a dangerous question. Are the things we call freedom truly freedom, or merely obedience to invisible threads long woven by history? It was a remarkably early question, and precisely because it came so early, it carried an almost naive honesty. Nietzsche had no ambition to destroy anything. He was simply trying to understand. But sometimes, the attempt to understand something entirely is itself what begins to loosen the foundations. In that essay, Nietzsche began to view history not as a necessary flow, guided by divine will, but as a sequence of interpretations, ways in which human beings tell their own story in order to continue living. He sensed that what is called destiny is often nothing more than another name for habit, and that what is called history is sometimes a record written by the victors, then handed down as truth. If this is so, if values, beliefs, and moral norms all bear the marks of circumstance, then an unavoidable question emerges. Are we living according to our own choices, or according to scripts written long before we were born? This was the first gateway leading Nietzsche toward the abyss of philosophy. Not the abyss of pessimism, but of honesty. Honesty so severe that it refuses to hide behind easy consolations. What is striking is that Nietzsche did not draw conclusions. He did not declare that human beings are wholly determined, but neither did he accept freedom as a self-evident gift. He stood in between, on a fragile boundary, where human beings are both shaped by history and yet yearn to break free from it. That position in between is deeply unsettling. It does not allow rest, and for Nietzsche, it began to seep into every corner of his intellectual life. From that point on, he developed a dangerous habit, the habit of questioning foundational assumptions, not merely asking, "Is this true?" but probing further. Who benefits if this is considered valid? What happens if we look at it from another angle? This habit gradually drew Nietzsche away from traditional modes of learning. At Schulpforta, the curriculum was designed to produce excellence. But Nietzsche was no longer satisfied with meeting standards. He wanted to reach the core, and that core, he realized, did not lie in approved answers, but in questions no one yet wished to ask. When the intellect begins to follow its own path, it often pays the price of friction with established frameworks. Nietzsche continued to perform well, but his intellectual energy was increasingly absorbed by reflections that had no official place in the curriculum. He read beyond requirements. He wrote beyond assignments, and he thought beyond expectations. Graduation examinations arrived in 1864. Nietzsche's results were barely sufficient to pass. To many, this signaled a decline. To Nietzsche, it was the inevitable consequence of a mind that had begun to live according to its own rhythm. His family viewed those results with concern. They hoped he would continue along the path of theology, a path that was stable, respected, and safe. Nietzsche, though not yet openly defiant, sensed something clearly. If he continued down that path, he would betray the very question that had awakened within him. Fate and history was therefore not merely an essay. It was a psychological milestone. It marked the moment Nietzsche began to understand that, to remain honest with one's own thinking, one must sometimes accept leaving behind what is most familiar. Yet leaving does not mean total solitude. When one door closes, another often opens, quietly and unexpectedly. Nietzsche entered university life with hesitation, intertwined with expectation. At first, he complied with his family's wishes and enrolled in theology. But beneath that compliance flowed another current, a growing pull toward questions that were larger, darker, and more honest. In library corridors, among dust-covered shelves, Nietzsche would soon encounter a strange voice, a voice that did not console, did not promise, yet spoke directly to the unease he had carried since the essay he wrote at 17. It would not be a teacher of flesh and blood, but a teacher in books. A philosopher who would give Nietzsche the language to name what he had said from very early on, that behind history, behind morality, behind the values held sacred, there may be nothing more than a blind will driving the world. And the name of that voice, Arthur Schopenhauer, was about to enter Nietzsche's life, like a collision of destiny. There are encounters that do not take place between two people. There is no handshake, no exchanged glance, only a voice rising from the printed page, and once it speaks, the inner world is never quite the same. When Friedrich Nietzsche entered university life, he carried with him a quiet hesitation. His family hoped he would study theology as a continuation of the old order, the order that had once supported his childhood, and Nietzsche tried, not because he lacked the courage to refuse, but because he wanted to know whether the familiar answers could withstand the questions that had awakened within him. It did not take long for him to realize that his intellectual heart lay elsewhere. The lectures in theology spoke of faith as something to be accepted. Nietzsche, however, could no longer accept without questioning. He turned instead to classical philology, a discipline that appeared dry on the surface, yet allowed him to approach the history of thought, of language, of civilizations that had once believed, feared, and hoped. Then one day, in an old bookshop in Leipzig, among dark wooden shelves and the scent of paper aged by time, Nietzsche picked up a thick volume with a somber cover. He did not yet know that this moment would carve itself into his life like a delicate incision. The title of the book was The World as Will and Representation. The author's name, Arthur Schopenhauer. Nietzsche took the book home, not with expectation, but with a vague sensation, as if he had just picked up something strangely familiar, though he had never touched it before. Over the next 2 weeks, he nearly disappeared from the world around him. He read, not to memorize, but to recognize himself. Schopenhauer did not offer comfort. He did not claim that the world possessed a moral order, that suffering had a higher purpose, or that history was moving toward something better. Quite the opposite. Schopenhauer argued that behind every phenomenon, every rational structure, every hope, there operates something blind, a will without purpose, without morality, indifferent to human happiness. The world, according to Schopenhauer, was not designed for human beings. It was merely a stage upon which the will endlessly tore at itself, and human beings, with their fragile consciousness, were condemned to endure the spectacle. For many, such a philosophy was unbearably dark, but for the young Nietzsche, it carried a strange sense of liberation, for Schopenhauer had done what few dared to do. He named suffering without covering it with consolation. Nietzsche recognized in Schopenhauer someone who had gone all the way to the end of the question he himself had only dared to pose in his essay, Fate and History. If history did not guarantee meaning, if morality was not secured by God, then perhaps human suffering was not a mistake, but a fundamental condition of existence. Yet Schopenhauer did not stop at despair. He pointed toward a temporary escape from this vortex, art. In art, music, poetry, tragedy, human beings could briefly escape the pressure of the will, becoming calm observers, if only for a moment. For Nietzsche, this rang like a familiar bell. Music in Naumburg, evenings at the piano, the sense that beauty could hold a person in place when everything else collapsed. Schopenhauer had given Nietzsche a philosophical language for something he had intuited very early on. From that moment, Schopenhauer became the teacher, not because he was right about everything, but because he was ruthlessly honest. Nietzsche admired that. He called Schopenhauer an educator in the most profound sense, one who does not teach others what to think, but teaches them how to face what is uncomfortable. In the years that followed, Nietzsche lived with Schopenhauer as one lives with a vast shadow. He reread him, annotated him, and carried on a silent dialogue. Yet even in the most profound admiration, a quiet divergence had begun to form. Schopenhauer chose the path of withdrawal. He viewed the negation of the will through asceticism, through renunciation, as the path to liberation. Nietzsche was different. Though he could not yet articulate it, he already sensed that he could not live by negation alone. There was something within him, an energy, a rhythm, that would not allow him to turn his back on life, however painful life might be. Schopenhauer gave Nietzsche the courage to look into the abyss. But Nietzsche, later on, would want to do something more daring, not only to look, but to dance at its edge. At this point, that difference had not yet revealed itself. Nietzsche was still in a phase of being sustained by a robust system of thought, by the feeling that he had finally found someone who spoke the truth for him. But the history of ideas rarely ends with admiration, for soon enough Nietzsche would encounter another figure, not in books but in flesh and blood, an artist who would turn Schopenhauer's philosophy into sound, into stage, into living myth. And in the radiance of that artist, Nietzsche would take another step, one that would carry him from scholar to a dreamer of cultural redemption. The name of that figure was Richard Wagner, and the fascination that was about to unfold would both lift Nietzsche upward and quietly prepare him for a painful fall. There are ideas that, while confined to books, remain cold. They may make us tremble in silence, yet they keep their distance. Like distant starlight, only when an idea steps forth as a living, breathing person, one with a voice, with eyes, with a palpable presence, does it become something intoxicating. Schopenhauer had given Nietzsche a worldview. The world is suffering, and art is a rare escape. But Schopenhauer remained a teacher encountered in books, a figure Nietzsche met in solitude. Wagner, by contrast, was the life of that philosophy. Wagner was music stepping out of the page, becoming a current of heat capable of burning through an entire life. Their meeting took place in November 1868 in Leipzig. Nietzsche was still very young then, a scholar in formation, a mind opening outward, and also a heart in need of a new center after the losses of early life. Wagner was different, already a living legend, an artist whose name carried both glory and scandal, a man whose presence made those before him feel as though they were standing before a storm held under control. In that first moment, Nietzsche almost did not see Wagner as a man. He saw him as destiny, as a symbol of an art capable of redeeming humanity from mediocrity, from small lives, from moral conventions that had grown stale. It was a dangerous feeling, for when we encounter an idol at the moment we are weakest, we do not merely admire, we confer authority. And Nietzsche conferred that authority. He believed that Wagner's music was not merely music, it was a ritual, a doorway back to ancient Greek tragedy, where human beings dared to face chaos, dared to look upon the naked truth of suffering, and still found a beauty capable of lifting them upward. In Nietzsche's imagination, Wagner became the answer to the most significant question of all. How can a culture survive when all its old values begin to tremble? Wagner resembled a new spiritual father, not a father of morality, but a father of art. Someone who could replace what Nietzsche had lost in Röcken: order, meaning, and the sense that there was a center around which life could turn. Nietzsche was enchanted not only by the music, but also by the entire atmosphere surrounding Wagner, where Wagner lived, in conversations, in gatherings, in dreams of a Germany reborn through art. Nietzsche felt himself entering a world of greater intensity than ordinary life, and for a mind that had always sought intensity, this was a powerful wine. At that time, Nietzsche still believed in the idea of cultural redemption. He thought that the West was weary, enfeebled, eroded by cold rationalism, by petty morality, by the complacency of the crowd, and he believed that art, great art, could revive a primordial vitality, like Dionysus returning in ritual dance. It was precisely this belief that led Nietzsche to his first significant work, The Birth of Tragedy. If Schopenhauer had given him the language of suffering, Wagner gave him the longing to transform suffering into an artistic festival. In Nietzsche's mind, two currents merged. Schopenhauer: life is suffering, salvation lies in art. Wagner: art does not merely redeem individuals, it can redeem an entire culture. It was a grand dream, and like all grand dreams, it already contained the seeds of rupture. But at this moment, Nietzsche did not yet know it. He was still on the dawn side of enchantment. He looked upon Wagner as upon another mountain, a mountain of art, where one might escape mediocrity and ascend toward the noble. And perhaps the most intimate element of this enchantment was this: Nietzsche did not merely find a genius. He found a sense of belonging, a spiritual family, a place where he could set down his intellectual heart and say, "Here, I am not alone." It was a rare moment of warmth in Nietzsche's life. Yet if we listen carefully, within every enchantment, there is a faint whisper of the future. That whisper does not say that Wagner will betray Nietzsche. It says something simpler. Every idol has its price. Nietzsche would grow. He would begin to see things in Wagner that he had once refused to see: nationalism, collective self-glorification, moral tones that Nietzsche would come increasingly to detest. And more importantly, he would realize that an artist, no matter how great, is still a human being, and human beings can always return to old comforts, easy beliefs, and collective symbols. But that moment had not yet arrived. For now, Nietzsche was stepping into adulthood, carrying the belief that he had found a flame capable of warming an entire age. And then, an unexpected turning point occurred. In 1869, at only 24 years of age, Nietzsche was appointed professor of classical philology at the University of Basel, an extraordinary honor for someone so young. For the first time, Nietzsche had a stable position, an academic foundation, a place from which to turn his intellectual dreams into work. In Basel, Nietzsche would begin writing his first book, a book that was at once philosophy, artistic manifesto, and a mirror of his own soul, The Birth of Tragedy. And within that book, two gods would appear, Apollo and Dionysus, as two halves of a single human being struggling to live with himself. There are moments in a person's life when all the fragments suddenly align into a precise shape, not because the world becomes easier to understand, but because we finally find a language capable of naming the tension that has long lived within us. For Friedrich Nietzsche, That moment arrived in Basel. In 1869, at just 24 years of age, Nietzsche was appointed professor of classical philology at the University of Basel, an honor almost absurd for someone so young, a mind barely risen from the student's bench, now placed in a position that often takes decades to reach. Basel, the quiet city by the Rhine, became the place where Nietzsche gained something his life rarely offered him: stability. Yet that stability did not bring peace. It merely sharpened what had long been there, a mind that lived in intensity and a body that lived in pain. While Nietzsche lectured before students, while he walked the corridors of academia, there existed within him another depth, a region where ideas smoldered like embers, where physical suffering fused with spiritual unease. And from that depth emerged his first major book, The Birth of Tragedy. This book was not merely a scholarly study of ancient Greece, it was more like a mirror. Nietzsche gazed into Greek tragedy, but what appeared before his eyes was his own soul, a soul stretched taut between two opposing forces. He named those forces after two gods, Apollo and Dionysus. Apollo, the god of light, of form, of order. Apollo is the framed dream, measured beauty, the harmony human beings construct in order to endure the world. Apollo gives us boundaries. Apollo says, look at life as a picture, beautiful, clear, defined. Dionysus, by contrast, is the god of wine, intoxication, and chaos. Dionysus is the dissolution of the self, the moment when the individual no longer stands apart, but merges with the shared pulse of existence. Wild, unstructured, terrifying, and seductive at once. Dionysus says, do not. Stand outside and watch. Step in. Let yourself be carried away. Nietzsche argued that Greek civilization reached its height not by choosing one over the other, but by uniting both. Greek tragedy was great because it allowed human beings to confront the most terrifying truth, that life is full of suffering, without inherent meaning, without guarantees, yet still placed that truth within an artistic form, beautiful enough to be endured. It was an idea at once scholarly and deeply personal, for Nietzsche was not merely analyzing Greece, he was analyzing himself. Apollo was Nietzsche by day, the meticulous philologist, the man at the lectern, the reader of ancient texts governed by iron discipline. Apollo was the part of him shaped by Schulpforta, the part that believed in structure, precision, and the beauty of intellect. Dionysus was Nietzsche by night, the man torn by violent headaches who felt the chaos of existence like an electric current beneath the skin. Dionysus was the part of him that longed for a stronger, deeper life, a life not only correct, but real, hot, and untamable. When Nietzsche wrote about Apollo and Dionysus, it was as though he were writing about two forces pulling him in opposite directions. And this is what makes the book extraordinary. It does not merely speak about tragedy. It is a tragedy, the tragedy of a mind trying to turn suffering into art, chaos into meaning. Within the book, Nietzsche also quietly assigned a special role to Wagner. He saw Wagner as the artist capable of reviving the Dionysian spirit, the one who could restore tragedy to the modern age and redeem a culture grown weary. This was the moment when Nietzsche still believed that art could redeem, that salvation might exist within life itself, without heaven, without metaphysical promises. Yet precisely here, within that dream of redemption, we can already see the seed of another pain. When you place too much hope in a single form of salvation, the wound is deepest when it fails to arrive. And reality arrived swiftly. Nietzsche expected the birth of tragedy to cause an earthquake. He did not write it as a minor academic essay. He wrote it as a call, an attempt to awaken German intellectual life from the dryness of rationalism and the complacency of scholarship. But the world did not awaken. The world responded with silence. Not a gentle silence, but a crushing one. The kind that makes you doubt yourself, that forces you to wonder whether what you see is real or merely a private delusion. And then instead of recognition, Nietzsche received an attack. A young scholar, Wilamowitz Moellendorff, denounced the book as unscientific, fanciful, and a betrayal of academic standards. For Nietzsche, this was not merely a professional dispute. It was a sign. Scholarship could become a system that protects itself by excluding unfamiliar voices. And if scholarship was Apollo, order, norm, form, then Nietzsche had just introduced Dionysus into its midst. He had placed the chaos of life inside a space devoted to neatness. It was hardly surprising that it was rejected. Nietzsche did not retreat, but he began to feel an ever-widening distance from the academic world, a distance that would not remain confined to disputes on paper. For if the birth of tragedy was the work of a Nietzsche who still believed in artistic redemption and in idols, the years ahead would push him much further, to the point where he would have to shatter the greatest idol of his own life with his own hands. Before that happens, however, we must pause at a crucial moment. The moment Nietzsche realizes that the most painful experience is sometimes not being attacked, but not being heard. The silence of the world begins here. And within that silence, Nietzsche would descend further into solitude, deeper into dialogue with himself, until one day he would understand that if no one understands him, perhaps that too is a form of freedom. But that freedom is cold, and it would open the path to the fractures yet to come. Fractures that would be both liberating and destructive. Some wounds do not come from a blow. They come from absence, from calling out loudly into the darkness and hearing no reply. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote The Birth of Tragedy with a belief that was almost naive, yet fiercely intense, that if an idea were alive enough, hot enough, true enough, it would find its own way into the world. He did not merely want to publish a book. He tried to awaken a culture. He wanted to pull the West out of the dryness of cold rationalism and return it to tragedy, to the courage to look directly at the chaos of existence and still say yes to life. But the world did not awaken. The world fell silent. We sometimes think silence means that nothing happened, but for someone who lived by intensity, like Nietzsche, silence was a force. It was an invisible wall. It did not push you away. It let you fall into the emptiness of yourself. In Basel, Nietzsche continued to teach, continued to live within the framework of academia. The corridors still echoed with footsteps. Classes still took place. Yet within him, a cold region was spreading, the area of questions. Am I wrong? Is what I see real, or is it only a private dream of my own? Nietzsche had hoped the academic world would argue, criticize, or at least pay attention. Even a fierce debate is proof that you exist. Silence, by contrast, feels as though you were never born at all. Eventually a response did come, but it was not dialogue. It was a verdict. A young scholar, Wilamowitz Moellendorff, launched a brutal intellectual attack on Nietzsche's book, denouncing it as unscientific, dreamy, and a betrayal of philological standards. In the academic world, one does not always need to defeat you by proving you wrong. It is often enough to declare that you do not belong here. And that is precisely what Nietzsche felt. At its deepest level, this was no longer a story about a book. It was a story about power. Power does not exist only in politics or violence. Power also resides in systems that appear neutral, such as academia, when those systems decide what counts as legitimate, what may be heard, and what must be pushed into silence. Nietzsche had brought Dionysus, chaos, intensity, naked truth, into a world of Apollo, order, rules, norms. And Apollo responded by tightening the frame, forcing the chaos back out. During those days, Nietzsche began to grasp a painful truth. The world does not reject you only because you are wrong. The world rejects you because you make it uneasy. But that unease did not come solely from the academic establishment. It also arose within Nietzsche himself, for he was the one who had wagered everything on a grand dream, the dream that art could redeem. When that dream is answered with silence, the most frightening thing is not failure. It is the shaking of belief itself. If art cannot redeem, then what can? Within that silence, Nietzsche withdrew ever more deeply into solitude. And his solitude was not merely social. It was a mental condition, a way of living in which you no longer expect to be understood, in which you are left only with the task of explaining yourself to yourself. This drew Nietzsche further and further away from the academic world. He continued to perform his duties as a professor, but inwardly he began to lose any sense of belonging, like someone standing in a crowded room who never hears his name called. The silence of the world, then, was not merely a reaction. It was a phase, a bridge carrying Nietzsche from the hopeful scholar to the free spirit he would later become. A man who no longer believed that recognition by the crowd or by academia could determine the value of truth. But before Nietzsche could become a free spirit, one great umbilical cord still bound him to the world: Wagner. In the early years at Basel, Wagner and Nietzsche were close, like a spiritual family. Wagner embodied the dream of artistic redemption. Wagner was where Nietzsche placed his faith when the academic world turned away. And perhaps for that very reason, the silence of the world caused Nietzsche to cling even more tightly to Wagner, like someone gripping a post in icy water. Yet when we cling too tightly to an idol, we often fail to see that the idol can also become a prison. As the years passed, Nietzsche began to notice in Wagner things he had previously chosen to overlook: shades of nationalism, collective obsessions, moral self-righteousness draped in artistic form, and above all, a return to Christian themes, as though Wagner could not live without some metaphysical consolation. For Nietzsche, this was a dangerous sign, for he himself was moving in the opposite direction, believing less and less in consolation, growing increasingly repulsed by the promises that weaken human beings. Thus, the silence of the world prepared Nietzsche for a second fall, a deeper one, the fall of having to shatter, with his own hands, the idol he had once revered. If the academic world had made Nietzsche lonely, the rupture with Wagner would leave him exposed. And when a person loses a spiritual father for the second time in life, the void that opens is no longer like Röcken. It is deeper, colder, and it has no God to fill it. Yet it is precisely within that void that Nietzsche will take another step into the abyss he will not only gaze into, but begin to strike with his hammer. Sometimes, silence is the beginning of a new voice, a voice that no longer asks permission to be heard, a voice that accepts this: even if the world does not wish to listen, one must still speak, not to be recognized, but to remain faithful to life itself. And in the next part, we will witness that moment. The moment Nietzsche looks directly at the idol and allows its twilight to begin. There are farewells that do not unfold in anger. They unfold in silence, and it is precisely that silence which makes the cut deeper than any words ever could. For many years, Richard Wagner was not merely an older friend to Friedrich Nietzsche. He was a spiritual center, the convergence point of everything Nietzsche believed might redeem a culture in decline. In Wagner, Nietzsche once saw a rare harmony between thought and art, between philosophical depth and emotional force, a promise that modern life could still give birth to greatness. But idols, like all structures built from hope, always carry within them the seeds of fracture. The change did not arrive in a single moment. It came slowly, layer by layer, like evening light falling upon a familiar statue, revealing cracks invisible in daylight. Nietzsche began to notice in Wagner things that unsettled him: a fascination with nationalism, collective obsessions, and above all, a yearning to return to Christian symbols, symbols of redemption, sacrifice, and the negation of earthly life. For Nietzsche, this was not an aesthetic disagreement. It was a spiritual betrayal. Nietzsche himself was moving in the opposite direction. He was growing increasingly suspicious of every form of metaphysical consolation. He felt revulsion toward promises of meaning used to mask the fear of living. He believed that life, with all its chaos and pain, did not need to be redeemed from itself. It needed to be affirmed. And then Wagner unveiled Parsifal, an opera saturated with Christian spirit, glorifying purity, redemption, and suffering as a moral path. For Nietzsche, this was the moment when everything became clear. Wagner, the man who had once embodied Dionysus, had returned to Apollo, and beyond that, returned to the cross. The twilight of the idol began there. There was no direct confrontation, no declaration of rupture, only an ever-growing distance, like two trajectories once parallel, slowly drifting apart. Nietzsche could no longer remain silent, yet he did not choose a personal attack. Instead, he did the only thing a sincere thinker could do. He wrote. In 1878, Nietzsche published Human, All Too Human. The book does not mention Wagner by name, but it is a cold blade cutting into the entire foundation of idol worship: genius, sanctity, blind faith in grand symbols. Nietzsche attacked everything he had once revered, not because it was weak, but because it weakened human beings. He sent the book to Wagner. It was a gesture both courageous and cruel, for Nietzsche understood perfectly well. This was no longer a dialogue, it was a farewell, and Wagner understood as well. His response was not a rebuttal. He chose the coldest possible reply: silence. The spiritual umbilical cord was severed without a sound. For Nietzsche, this was the second significant loss of his life, more profound, more complex than the first. This time, he did not lose a biological father. He lost a spiritual one. A center he had willingly constructed and now had to dismantle with his own hands. The price of freedom is always solitude. Nietzsche emerged from that relationship not as a victor, but as someone stripped of illusions, exposed, without refuge. Yet within that exposure, something new appeared: absolute honesty with himself. He began to see that all idols, whether forged from art or morality, are subtle structures of power. They demand that human beings bow, sacrifice themselves in the service of something larger than life. And Nietzsche was no longer willing to bow. The twilight of Wagner was not merely the twilight of a man. It was the twilight of an entire way of thinking. The belief that human beings require collective symbols in order to live meaningfully. Nietzsche began to walk another path, a path where each individual must face life directly, without intermediaries, without idols, without promises. But such freedom is not a reward, it is a burden. After severing ties with Wagner, Nietzsche did not find a new center. No spiritual community replaced the old one. No applause followed. No validation arrived. There was only Nietzsche and a body steadily deteriorating. The headaches grew more violent. His eyesight worsened. Prolonged bouts of nausea drained his strength. The free spirit Nietzsche had won came with a very real biological cost. He began to feel that he was living inside a body that no longer obeyed him. And then came the moment when he understood that he could no longer pretend to be stable. He could no longer stand at the lectern, playing the role of professor, while everything inside was collapsing. The twilight of the idol opened the way for another twilight, the twilight of a stable academic career. A painful decision lay ahead. Another farewell, this time not to a person, but to an entire role. And when Nietzsche wrote his letter of resignation, he did not yet know that he was stepping into a new phase of life. The phase of the wanderer, of a spirit without anchorage, forced to learn how to live without any form of protection at all. But before setting out, Nietzsche would have to say goodbye to Basel. And in the next part, we will witness that moment, when the body compels the spirit to stop, and when a stable life closes its doors to make way for a far more dangerous journey, the journey of walking alone. There are farewells that require no witnesses. They take place in a darkened room between an exhausted body and a mind that no longer has shelter. Basel, the city by the Rhine, had once been a promise. There, Friedrich Nietzsche had a position, a title, a clearly defined place within the academic world. There, he lectured, wrote, conversed with colleagues, and walked along the riverbank like someone who had arrived. Yet that promise gradually became a burden, not because Basel diminished him, but because it was no longer spacious enough to contain what was unfolding within him. The body was the first to rebel. The headaches arrived without warning, like hammer blows striking directly at his forehead. His eyesight blurred. At times, the entire world dissolved into wavering streaks of light. His stomach revolted. Prolonged bouts of vomiting drained him of all strength. There were days when Nietzsche could not read, could not write, could not even stand upright. He felt himself living inside a body that no longer cooperated, a body that seemed to say, "This is as far as you can go." But physical pain was only the surface. Beneath it lay a more profound exhaustion, the exhaustion of having to perform a role, the role of a stable professor, the role of a member of a system that felt increasingly alien to him. The role of a person is expected to be appropriate, proper, and to continue along a path already laid out. Nietzsche no longer believed in that path. After the rupture with Wagner, after the silence of the academic world, he understood that he could not continue living under old forms of protection, but to abandon them meant stepping into a void without guarantees, without titles, without refuge. It was a harsh choice, and not everyone has the strength to make it. Nietzsche tried to endure. He requested leave of absence, hoping his health would recover. He attempted to adjust his pace of life, to lower the intensity, but the body did not listen, and somewhere, at a deeper level, Nietzsche understood that the problem was not only his health. The problem was this: he no longer belonged in Basel. There are places which, if we remain in them too long, slowly kill us, not through lack of oxygen, but through lack of truth. Basel, with all its order and prestige, had become such a place for Nietzsche. The decision to resign did not come as an explosion, but as a lucid surrender. In 1879, at the age of 34, when many people are only beginning their careers, Nietzsche wrote his letter of resignation from the University of Basel. There was no loud drama, no farewell speech, only a quiet acknowledgement. I cannot continue like this. To the outside world, this decision was baffling. To abandon a stable, prestigious position in exchange for an uncertain future seemed irrational. But to Nietzsche, remaining would have been foolish, for to stay meant betraying what he was beginning to learn, that life should not be lived as a prolonged compromise. The farewell to Basel was therefore not merely a professional event. It was a rite of transformation, a door closing, not to protect Nietzsche, but to force him outward. When Nietzsche left Basel, he had no grand plan, no fixed destination, no community is waiting to receive him. He possessed only a modest pension, a small suitcase, and a frail body. Yet within that fragility lived a stern resolve. If one must live truthfully. This was the moment Nietzsche truly became a free spirit, not in the romantic sense, but in the starkest possible meaning. A spirit no longer bound by titles, institutions, or the expectations of others, but also a spirit forced to bear all the consequences of that freedom alone. Leaving Basel, Nietzsche entered a nomadic life. He wandered between regions with milder climates, Switzerland, Italy, the south of France, constantly searching for places his body could endure and where his mind could continue to work. He lived in small rented rooms, temporary hotels, obscure towns no one remembered. During those days, Nietzsche began to learn a new lesson, one not found in books: how to live without external structures, no teaching schedules, no colleagues, no fixed routine, only pain, thought, and extended silence. Yet within that silence, something strange occurred. As every form of protection collapsed, Nietzsche began to hear his own voice more clearly. There was no one left to please, no one left to resist. Only a naked question remained. What will you do with this life? The farewell to Basel, then, was not the end of a career. It was the beginning of an experiment in living. An experiment not meant to prove anything to the world, but to see whether a human being could live without old consolations, without God, without idols, without academia, and still say yes to life. The answer did not arrive at once. It would come slowly, very slowly, through solitary footsteps, through sleepless nights, through pains that seemed unbearable. But from this moment on, Nietzsche had gone too far to turn back. Basel lay behind him, like a safe harbor he had chosen to leave. Ahead stretched nameless roads, where he would have to travel in the company of nothing but his own shadow. And in the next part, we will enter that phase. The phase of the wanderer, of a man learning to live with solitude as an unwilling companion. There are freedoms that do not arrive with a sense of lightness. They arrive with a coldness of having no place left to cling to, and no one left to blame. After bidding farewell to Basel, Friedrich Nietzsche entered the life he himself called the life of the free spirit. But this freedom did not resemble radiant adventures. It began with a small suitcase, a few books, trains departing stations in silence, and a frail body forced to learn endurance one day at a time. Nietzsche had no home. He had temporary refuges. He moved between Switzerland, northern Italy, and southern France, constantly searching for a climate easier to breathe in, a light less painful to the eyes, a rhythm of life that would not crush the headaches and stomach ailments that had become his constant companions. Every place he arrived at was a small experiment. Here, can one live a little longer? This freedom had one defining trait. It had no audience, no students, no colleagues, no academic debates. Nietzsche lived outside all roles. And when roles fall away, a person is forced to confront himself without costume, without title. There were days when Nietzsche could barely write. Pain arrived like a wave, sweeping him out of thought. But there were other days, rare and precious, when the pain retreated a step and his mind flared into clarity. It was in these moments that he began to write in a new way. No more thick treatises, no more closed systems. In their place came fragments, short, sharp, sometimes ruthless. Nietzsche began to write in aphorisms, condense thoughts like knife points. This was no random choice. It was the form suited to a life broken into pieces, suited to a spirit that no longer believed in artificial wholes. The free spirit, for Nietzsche, was not about doing whatever one wishes. It was about escaping the need for approval, escaping correct opinions, escaping moralities handed down like inheritances. He began to view morality as a historical phenomenon, something created, maintained, and imposed by invisible forces, power, habit, fear. And when you view morality this way, something uncomfortable emerges. Much of what is called noble is, in fact, merely the rationalization of weakness. Many sermons about humility, sacrifice, and resignation, Nietzsche argued, are not meant to make human beings better, but easier to control. This was the period when Nietzsche began to become dangerous. Not dangerous because he incited violence, but because he placed questions exactly where society does not want to be touched. He asked, who benefits when a value is declared sacred? Who loses when we believe suffering is noble? What happens if we view morality as a survival strategy rather than an eternal truth? The free spirit does not bring happiness. It brings lucidity. And lucidity, in a world built on necessary illusions, is a lonely state. Nietzsche was acutely aware of that price. He wrote of solitude not as a complaint, but as a condition. If you wish to see farther than the crowd, you must stand outside the crowd. If you want to remain honest with your own thinking, you must accept that very few will walk with you all the way. On long walks, through mountain paths and small towns, Nietzsche lived with his own shadow, not the shadow of the past, but the shadow of the present, a person with no shelter left, yet also no chains. Here lies a profound paradox. The freer Nietzsche became, the more he was driven inward. There was no one left to emulate, no idol to follow. Every value had to be created or rejected by himself. And the act of creating values is not romantic. It is an immense burden. Within that burden, Nietzsche began to feel a profoundly human longing, the longing to be understood, to share, to have another mind touch his own. The free spirit does not erase the need for connection. It only makes that need more dangerous, for if you connect wrongly, you risk losing yourself. And then, in what seemed like an ordinary moment, a person appeared, bringing intellect, independence, and a rare capacity for understanding. Someone who made Nietzsche believe that perhaps, just perhaps, the free spirit did not have to live alone forever. Her name was Lou Salomé. Lou's arrival was not an ordinary romantic tale. It was a collision of intensities, and for Nietzsche, already living at the edge of endurance, that collision would shake the entire fragile structure he had just built for himself. The free spirit was about to face its most significant test. Can a human being open his heart without losing his freedom? Or do all deep connections carry within them the danger of returning to old chains? The answer would not be gentle, and in the next part, we will step into that tragedy, the tragedy of Lou Salomé, where Nietzsche touches the bottom of despair, and from there prepares for an even more violent transformation. There are tragedies that require no war, no blood, only a lonely heart that believes it has finally found someone who can understand. After years of wandering, after severing himself from stable academia and shattering the idol of Wagner with his own hands, Friedrich Nietzsche lived in a peculiar state, free yet exposed. He had liberated himself from external structures, but was forced to carry a cold truth. That freedom does not automatically generate warmth. And it was within that coldness that, in 1882, Nietzsche met Lou von Salomé. Lou was a young Russian woman, intelligent, incisive, and fiercely independent, to a degree that both attracted and unsettled many men of her time. She carried a kind of light unlike any Nietzsche had known before. Not the light of devotion he had known in Röcken, not the light of discipline from Schulpforta, and not the artistic aura of Wagner. Lou bore the light of a free intellect, an intellect that did not ask permission, did not plead, did not lean for support. Nietzsche was drawn in almost immediately. Near 40 years old, burdened by a body in constant pain and by long years of solitude, Nietzsche felt as though he had touched a possibility he had forgotten, the possibility of being understood without having to explain too much. Lou did not see him as a professor or a philosopher. She saw him as a mind living at high intensity, and to Nietzsche, that felt like breathing again. In his conversations with Lou, Nietzsche rediscovered something he had lost long ago, a genuine sense of dialogue, not dialogue with academia, where words are weighed by standards, not dialogue with the crowd, where ideas are swallowed by slogans, but dialogue between people daring to live by ideas. At times, Nietzsche imagined a convent of free spirits, a small community where no one bowed before idols, where people could live as seekers of truth, unbound by conventional morality. In that vision, Lou was not merely a companion. She was a sign that such a dream might be possible. But tragedy often begins precisely at the point where one believes an escape has been found. Nietzsche did not want Lou only as an intellectual companion. He wanted more. And although he always regarded himself as an opponent of illusion, here he did not escape something deeply human, the longing to be chosen. He proposed to her, not once, and Lou refused. The refusal was not dramatic. There was no spectacle, but precisely for that reason, it hurt more. For it was not a battle. It was a fact. Lou did not belong to Nietzsche, and she did not wish to belong to anyone. Like a thin blade, that truth cut into Nietzsche at his weakest point, the place where he still longed for a support, a center, a fellow traveler with whom to share the burden of freedom. The tragedy did not come from Lou alone. It was intensified by invisible forces around them: jealousy, misunderstanding, and the intervention of Nietzsche's sister, Elizabeth, who deeply distrusted and opposed what she perceived as a threat to family and honor. Whispers, calculations, and small human emotions began to distort the dream of a convent of free spirits. The plan collapsed. Nietzsche was left standing at the edge of the very hope he had just built. And here lies the deepest pain. Nietzsche had spent his life arguing that human beings must stand on their own, must not rely on idols. Yet before Lou, he had done something very close to erecting a new idol. Not an idol of art, but of understanding. When that idol failed to materialize, the fall was not merely emotional. It was philosophical. It forced Nietzsche to face a cold question. If even understanding cannot be held on to, then what can a human being rely on? Nietzsche wrote to a friend, "This last fragment of life is the hardest morsel I have ever had to chew." The words sound like a rare confession, a raw truth, unadorned, without defense. In the days that followed, Nietzsche stood near the abyss of despair. Not despair because of Lou herself, but because Lou had pulled out the final pin holding together the last warm illusion in his life. When that illusion collapsed, he was thrown back entirely upon himself, upon his suffering body, his solitude, and a freedom too vast to carry easily. Yet sometimes, precisely when human energy has nowhere left to go, it begins to change direction. Nietzsche had once directed that energy outward, toward Wagner, toward a culture, toward a dream of redemption. Then he had directed it toward Lou, toward a personal bond that might soften solitude. When both paths collapsed, the remaining energy could not simply vanish. It turned inward. And when a great force is compressed within a sealed chamber, it seeks to explode. From this point onward, a psychological transformation began. Nietzsche started to do what he would later call, though not yet by name, an alchemical act of suffering, turning despair into creative material, turning wounds into language, turning rejection into a new command, no longer asking life for permission, but affirming it through pain itself. The tragedy of Lou Salomé, therefore, is not merely a sad chapter. It is a point of compression. It is a furnace, and within that furnace an idea began to form, an idea that would later become a central pillar of Nietzsche's thought. Amor Fati, the love of fate. Not loving fate because it is gentle, but loving it because it is cruel. Not accepting out of helplessness, but accepting as an act of power. I will not allow life to humiliate me with suffering. I will turn suffering into proof that I am alive. When life pushes you to the very edge of the abyss, you have two choices: fall, or learn to stand upright without trembling. Nietzsche chose the second, not because he did not hurt, but because he had no other choice if he wished to survive. And in the next part, we will see him do precisely that, forging a philosophy not meant to console, but to temper. A philosophy that promises no salvation, but teaches human beings to love, even what breaks them. There are moments in life when a person stands before two very simple, yet merciless choices. Either allow pain to define who you are, or redefine pain yourself. After the tragedy with Lou Salomé, Friedrich Nietzsche could no longer flee. Every familiar path had closed. There was no longer academia to hide within, no idol left to cling to, no relationship is strong enough to soften the weight of solitude. He was thrown back upon himself, bare, exhausted, and so depleted that there was no room left for easy consolation. Yet it was precisely in this state of being pressed to the limit that Nietzsche began to do something radically different from most people. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen to me?" he posed another question, one harder, colder, and more dangerous. "If this is unavoidable, what will I do with it?" This was the moment Amor Fati was born. Amor Fati, the love of fate, is not a slogan to hang on a wall. It is not positive advice. And it is undoubtedly not resignation. Amor Fati is an inner command, forged out of suffering. Love your fate. Not only what is pleasant, but also what crushes you. Nietzsche understood this with painful clarity. Life is not fair. It does not distribute suffering according to merit. It does not care about morality or good intentions. Pain arrives uninvited. Loss comes without warning. And if we accept only the beautiful parts of life, we will live forever in resistance, forever resentful, forever a victim, forever waiting for another, better world. Amor Fati is a refusal to live that way. For Nietzsche, loving fate does not mean smiling at suffering. It means looking directly at it and saying, I will not allow you to make me smaller. Not begging it to disappear, not justifying it through morality, but transforming it into material. Nietzsche began to see that every blow delivered by life, if it does not kill us, reveals a deeper question about who we are capable of becoming. And if we are brave enough, we can use those wild blows to forge a new form of ourselves. Amor Fati is therefore an act of power, but not power over others. It is the power of not being broken by circumstance. Nietzsche wrote about this not as a philosopher preaching doctrine, but as a man speaking to himself in order to survive. Every line on Amor Fati carries the breath of someone struggling to remain upright after every support has collapsed. There is a crucial subtlety here. Amor Fati does not erase suffering, nor does it promise that everything will turn out fine. What it does is change the relationship between human beings and suffering. Pain ceases to be evidence of failure. It becomes evidence of the intensity of life. If you can love your fate, every turn, every mistake, every tragedy, then nothing in your past can be used to shame you. Nothing can be used to strip you of your worth. You do not need forgiveness because you no longer regard yourself as guilty. This is a hazardous idea for any moral system built on guilt and redemption. For if human beings no longer feel ashamed of their own lives, they become far harder to control through fear. Nietzsche was not naive. He knew that Amor Fati is not for the many. It demands immense spiritual endurance, the ability to stand before the truth that life offers no guarantees. But for Nietzsche, living without guarantees was still preferable to living inside an illusion purchased at the cost of weakness. During these years, Nietzsche began to write in a different voice, harder, sharper, more assured, no longer seeking to persuade, no longer searching for agreement. He wrote as someone who had accepted that he might be misunderstood, disliked, even forgotten, so long as he did not betray what he knew to be true. Amor Fati also taught Nietzsche something about time. The past is no longer something to be corrected. It is something to be embraced entirely, without selection, without justification, without wishing it had been otherwise. For wishing the past to be different is to reject the present self, and Nietzsche would no longer accept that rejection. Yet Amor Fati is not an end point. It is a foundation strong enough to carry Nietzsche toward an idea even harsher, even more demanding. For if you truly love your fate, a terrifying question inevitably arises, one Nietzsche could not avoid. If you had to live this same life again, every detail, every pain, every mistake, countless times, would you be willing? Not to relive a better version, not to relive it after correcting the errors, but to relive it exactly as it was. Amor Fati prepared Nietzsche for this question. It forged in him a new spiritual posture, the posture of a human being capable of saying yes not only to this moment, but to the entire chain of moments that made his life what it is. And then, during a walk in Sils Maria, amid rock, light, and solitude, that idea struck Nietzsche like a lightning bolt, an idea both magnificent and terrifying, the idea of eternal recurrence. And in the next part, we will enter the final trial of Amor Fati, where Nietzsche no longer asks whether human beings can endure life, but something far more difficult. Can human beings love life so entirely that they would will it to return again and again, forever? There are ideas that are not born at a writing desk. They arrive only after one has been alone long enough, when there is no one left to converse with, except life itself. Sils Maria, once again, became the setting of revelation. Nearly 6,000 feet above sea level, amid silent rock formations and a sky so thin it seems almost transparent, Friedrich Nietzsche walked alone. His steps were slow. His breathing is careful. His body was still in pain, yet his mind, strangely, grew lucid. It was here, after Amor Fati, that another idea struck, not as a deduction, but as a question hurled straight into the center of existence. Nietzsche called it eternal recurrence. He did not present it as a doctrine. He posed it as a challenge. Imagine, Nietzsche says, that a demon comes to you in your loneliest hour and whispers, "This life you are living, you will have to live again countless times. Every moment, every pain, every mistake. Nothing new, nothing different." The question is not whether this is true. The question is, would you collapse or would you smile? This is where Nietzsche's philosophy becomes most merciless. Eternal recurrence allows no escape. It permits no hope of another world, no consolation that things will get better. It forces a person to confront their own life, unrevised, unexcused. If Amor Fati is the act of loving one's fate as it has been, then eternal recurrence asks whether one loves it enough to will it to return forever. Nietzsche understood the terror of this idea with complete clarity, for he did not speak from the position of a healthy, happy, well-loved man. He spoke from the position of one living with relentless physical pain, prolonged spiritual solitude, and irreparable losses. And precisely for that reason, the question cuts like a blade. If a human being like Nietzsche, with everything he had endured, could still say yes to eternal recurrence, then this was no abstract thought. It was a measure of inner strength. Eternal recurrence is not a theory of time. Nietzsche was not concerned with whether the universe literally repeats itself. What concerned him was the posture toward life that this idea compels us to adopt. For if you live each moment as though it will return infinitely, you can no longer live carelessly. You can no longer live as if life were a draft. Every choice, however small, carries eternal weight. Every action becomes an affirmation or a negation of life itself. Eternal recurrence is therefore the ultimate trial of Amor Fati. It asks, are you living a life you are willing to sign your name to, not once but endlessly? Nietzsche did not offer answers on behalf of others. He knew that very few could endure this question. Most people live by postponement, hoping the future will repair what the present dares not confront. Eternal recurrence cuts off that path of delay. For Nietzsche, this idea was not meant to drive humanity into despair. On the contrary, it was meant to create a new kind of human being, one strong enough to say yes to life without conditions, without guarantees, without promises. Here, Nietzsche moves beyond Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer saw life as a burden to be negated. Nietzsche saw life as a challenge, to be affirmed to the very end, even if that meant accepting the repetition of suffering. The eternal gaze also transformed Nietzsche's view of himself. The past was no longer something to flee from. It became something to embrace entirely. Every mistake, every wound, every tragedy, if they had occurred, became indispensable parts of the signature placed beneath one's life. Nietzsche did not say that human beings must be perfect. He said they must take responsibility for their lives, not before God, not before collective morality, but before that eternal question itself. In his solitude at Sils Maria, Nietzsche did not rejoice. He understood the price of what he had touched. A thought like this cannot be taught easily. It cannot become a slogan. It can only be lived or rejected. But Nietzsche had gone too far to turn back. Amor Fati had prepared him. Eternal recurrence pushed him one step further, to the boundary where one is no longer permitted to live halfway. And from that boundary, a new figure began to emerge. Not a philosopher, not a scholar, but a prophet, a voice that does not speak for others, yet dares to say what few dare to hear. Nietzsche needed a new language to express this. Not the language of treatises, not the language of systems, but the language of parable, of poetry, of proclamation, and for that reason, in the next part, Nietzsche will allow a figure to descend from the mountains, a figure who speaks in images, in paradoxes, in awakenings. His name is Zarathustra. There are ideas that lose their vitality when expressed in ordinary language. They require a different voice, not to explain, but to awaken. After Amor Fati and the eternal gaze, Friedrich Nietzsche understood that he could no longer write as he had before. The sharp aphorisms, the condensed fragments of thought, these had carried him to the edge of what could be said. But what was now forming within him demanded another form, broader, deeper, and more dangerous. Nietzsche needed a character, not to hide behind, but to speak what an ordinary author could not utter without being immediately misunderstood. He needed a voice both ancient and new, at once mythic and prophetic, like a call from the future. And thus, Zarathustra appeared. Why Zarathustra? The ancient Persian prophet. This choice was anything but accidental. The historical Zarathustra was the figure who laid the foundations of moral dualism, good and evil. He was the first to divide the world into opposing camps, to demand that human beings choose sides, to split values into right and wrong, pure and impure. Nietzsche chose Zarathustra not to honor him, but to overturn him. In a profound irony, Nietzsche allows the very one who committed the first error to become the first to recognize that error. Thus Spoke Zarathustra is not a philosophical book in the usual sense. It does not present arguments. It does not debate. It does not attempt to persuade. It resembles a hymn, rhythmic, imagistic, filled with metaphor, where ideas are not proven, but planted. The story opens with an image quintessentially Nietzschean. Zarathustra lives alone on a mountain for many years. Then one day, he decides to descend, not because he needs the world, but because the world needs to be shaken awake. Yet when Zarathustra speaks to human beings, what he receives in return is not understanding. It is a mockery, indifference, fear. For Zarathustra does not come to console. He comes to announce a dire message. God is dead, not as a simple declaration of atheism, but as a cultural diagnosis. Absolute values, metaphysical anchors, have lost their vitality, and humanity, though unwilling to admit it, now lives within a void. That void is both dangerous and full of possibility. Nietzsche understood well the fear provoked by this announcement, for if there is no God, no metaphysical guarantee, human beings must take responsibility for their own values, and most people do not want that responsibility. They want to return to old promises, even when those promises have grown hollow. Zarathustra offers no return path. Instead, he speaks of the Übermensch, the overman, not as a biological species, not as a ruler over others, but as a spiritual ideal. The overman is the human being who has passed through nihilism without being devoured by it, one who does not borrow values from the past, nor flee into a heavenly future, one who is strong enough to create values from this life itself. Zarathustra speaks these things in parables because Nietzsche knows that values cannot be imposed through logic. They can only be opened so that those with sufficient courage may step inside. The book is therefore filled with strange moments, sermons no one hears, encounters that end in misunderstanding, repeated retreats into solitude after truths are spoken too soon. At a deeper level, this is not only the story of a prophet, it is the story of Nietzsche himself, a man speaking truths for which there are not yet ears to hear. A quiet sadness runs through Zarathustra, the sadness of one who walks ahead of his time. Zarathustra does not resent the crowd. He understands them. He knows their fear, but he also refuses to lower his voice in order to be accepted. For when forced to choose between being understood and being truthful, Nietzsche, through Zarathustra, chooses truthfulness. What makes Zarathustra remarkable is not its individual great ideas, but the posture toward life embodies. A posture that does not plead, does not apologize, does not seek validation. A posture that dares to say yes to life, even when life offers no response. This is also the moment when Nietzsche's style reaches a new intensity. It becomes at once majestic and playful, severe and filled with laughter. Nietzsche begins to grasp that affirming life cannot wear only a solemn face. It requires joy as well, a joy born of strength, not of forgetting. Yet Zarathustra exacts its own price. In writing this book, Nietzsche lived in a prolonged state of tension. The feeling of being spoken through by a voice greater than himself both sustained him and exhausted him. The boundary between clarity and excessive intensity grew thin. Zarathustra is the summit of creative power, and also the place where Nietzsche stands dangerously close to the abyss. For when a human being dares to speak in the voice of a prophet, dares to carry the most significant questions of existence, the body and mind must pay a price. And Nietzsche, already fragile in health, was entering a phase in which creative intensity would rise to perilous levels. Thus spoke Zarathustra closes one journey, from scholar to free spirit, from personal pain to a call of awakening. But it also opens another, one in which Nietzsche will go further still in dismantling old values, in striking idols with his hammer to hear what they sound like. In the next part, Zarathustra will not only speak of destinations. He will trace the inner path a human being must travel, from burden to rebellion to creation. Three images will appear: the camel, the lion, and the child. And in these images, Nietzsche will leave us not with an answer, but with a map. There are truths that cannot be taught. They can only be lived, step by step, stage by stage, through each painful transformation of the spirit. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Friedrich Nietzsche does not speak only of humanity's destination. He understands that to talk of the overman without speaking of the inner path leading toward it is nothing more than an empty provocation, and so he offers a parable, gentle, simple, yet sharp as a blade. The parable of the three transformations of the spirit. Nietzsche does not write it as a diagram. He writes it as a whisper, meant for those patient enough to listen. For each image in this parable is not a theory, it is a way of living. The first state is the camel. The camel is the spirit that knows how to bow. It kneels and asks, what is the heaviest burden? Not to avoid it, but to prove its endurance. The camel lives by the words, thou shalt. You must obey, you must sacrifice, you must be humble, you must carry on your back the values handed down by society, family, religion, and tradition. Nietzsche does not despise the camel. On the contrary, he knows that without the stage of the camel, no one can go far. The camel forges endurance. It learns to bear weight, to persist, to survive in the desert of duty. But if one stops there, the camel will perish within its own obedience. For the burden is not the goal. It is only the condition. When the camel journeys deep enough into the desert, when the values it carries grow unbearably heavy, a transformation occurs. The spirit no longer asks, thou shalt. It roars a different question, will I? And from the camel, the lion is born. The lion is the spirit of negation. It does not carry burdens. It shatters them. It confronts the great dragon called thou shalt, a dragon stitched together from thousands of fragments of morality, law, duty, and familiar phrases like, this is how it has always been. The lion speaks a single word, no. No to inherited values. No to promises that weaken human beings. No to structures that demand submission. This stage is dangerous, and also the most seductive, for the lion brings a sense of liberation. It grants the power of rebellion, of self-assertion, of breaking chains. But Nietzsche is unsparing in his clarity. The lion can destroy, but it cannot create. If one stops at the lion, life becomes perpetual negation, always opposing, yet never knowing what one wishes to build, always angry, yet unaware of where that anger leads. Such a life, though it appears powerful, remains bound by the very things it resists. And therefore, a third transformation is required, the most difficult, the most fragile, and the highest of all. From the lion, the spirit must become the child. The child does not roar. It does not carry burdens. It plays. Nietzsche calls this the second innocence, not the innocence of ignorance, but of one who has known too much and still dares to begin again. The child speaks a different word than the lion. Not no, but yes. Yes to life. Yes to creation. Yes to the act of bringing forth new values, not out of duty, not out of rebellion, but out of the overflowing joy of life itself. The child does not justify. It does not need enemies. It does not need to prove itself right. It creates because it lives, and in that act of play, it carries a power no moral system can control, the power of beginning. Nietzsche understands with stark realism how rare this stage is. Most people live and die as camels, obedient, diligent, yet never asking what they truly desire. Some advance to the lion, rebellious, defiant, yet forever trapped in negation. The child is rare, because to become the child, one must pass through endurance and destruction, and then relinquish both. This parable is not advice. It is a mirror. Nietzsche does not tell us to become the child. He simply shows what happens if we do not move on. Either we are crushed by burdens or consumed by rage. At the deepest level, these three transformations also reflect Nietzsche's own life. He was once the camel, Bearing the weight of morality, scholarship, expectation, he became the lion, shattering idols, negating old values, saying no to the world. And in Zarathustra, he attempts to reach the child, a creative, affirmative spirit that dares to say yes to life, even after staring directly into the void. But this path is not safe. Each transformation consumes vital energy. And for Nietzsche, whose body was already fragile, the intensity of this spiritual journey began to exceed biological limits. In the years following Zarathustra, Nietzsche entered a phase of creativity so fierce it was almost frightening. He wrote rapidly, abundantly, with a confidence that grew increasingly absolute. Books followed one another as though time itself were running out. The three transformations were completed on the page, but in lived reality, another question was taking shape. Can the human body and mind endure the intensity of a spirit that has passed beyond every former boundary? The answer would not come through theory. It would come through a year of almost superhuman eruption. In that year, Nietzsche would write as if driven by a force beyond himself. In that year, the boundary between genius and collapse would become thinner than ever before. And in the next part, we will enter the year of miracles, where the brightest light begins to cast its longest shadow. There are years in a human life that do not last 12 months. They arrive like a storm, sudden, violent, and leave behind a change that cannot be undone. The year 1888 was such a year for Friedrich Nietzsche. From the outside, it appears almost unbelievable. A man of fragile health, living in isolation, without an academic position, without a supportive community, yet writing with an intensity rarely witnessed in the history of philosophy. Within a single year, Nietzsche completed a series of works: Twilight of the Idols, The Antichrist, Nietzsche contra Wagner, and Ecce Homo. Each was not a cautious step, but a strike. Fast, precise, unapologetic. This was the period in which Nietzsche's voice no longer whispered. It rang out, not to persuade, but to declare. Nietzsche wrote like someone who had reached the far end of doubt and had nothing left to lose. His sentences grew shorter, sharper, as though there were no time left for detours. At a deeper level, this was not merely the confidence of a mature intellect. It was the sensation of a human being who believed he had touched something fateful. In his correspondence, Nietzsche began to speak of himself in strange terms. He called himself a destiny, not out of simple arrogance, but because he believed he had laid hands on the deepest foundations of Western morality. And once those foundations began to tremble, history could no longer proceed as before. In Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche openly declared war on everything held sacred. He wielded the hammer not to destroy blindly, but to test. If an idol sounded hollow when struck, it did not deserve to stand. In The Antichrist, he attacked religion not as a doctrine, but as a psychology, a structure designed to weaken human beings, to make them love submission more than life. The tone no longer sought agreement. It carried a strange joy, the joy of someone who had moved beyond the fear of being misunderstood. Nietzsche wrote as if, at last, he could speak in his authentic voice without lowering the volume, without explanation. But here, the fragile boundary began to appear. Creativity at such intensity is not always a sign of health. At times, it is the symptom of a nervous system stretched beyond its limits. Nietzsche slept very little. He wrote incessantly. Ideas poured forth as though no filtering were required. There was a sense of urgency, as if time were contracting, as if he had to say everything now or lose the chance forever. Later readers of Nietzsche have often asked, was this the summit of genius or the first signs of collapse? Perhaps it was both. Nietzsche now lived in a peculiar state, at once extraordinarily lucid in thought and increasingly unmoored psychologically. He no longer clearly distinguished between seeing something profound and being chosen to proclaim it. The sense of mission, which had once been metaphorical, began to feel personal, immediate, and notably, Nietzsche did not appear afraid of this. On the contrary, he seemed to accept it as part of the price to be paid, as though he had decided that if he must break, he would break only after having said everything. The Year of Miracles thus bears two faces. On one hand, it stands as proof of a rare creative power, a mind daring to drive itself to the final limit. On the other hand, it serves as a quiet warning. Not everybody can endure the intensity of a spirit that has severed all former supports. Nietzsche no longer believed in balance. He believed in intensity, and intensity, sustained too long, demands a very real biological cost. The letters from the end of 1888 begin to change in tone. They grow stranger, more grandiose. Nietzsche signs his name with identities no longer belonging to ordinary life. The boundary between symbol and self begins to blur. The Year of Miracles is accelerating rapidly, and its light is beginning to cast a long shadow. Nietzsche had spoken nearly everything he needed to say. The remaining question was no longer philosophical. It was the question of body and mind. Can a human being survive after staring directly into the abyss without turning away? The answer would not come in books. It would arrive on a street in Turin, in a moment both tiny and impossible to forget. And in the next part, we will witness it. The collapse in Turin, when intensity reaches its final limit, and a great mind enters silence. There are moments in history that are not loud. They are not announced by thunder or lightning. They arrive quietly, and by the time we recognize them, everything has already changed forever. In the winter of 1888, Friedrich Nietzsche was living in Turin, an elegant and tranquil Italian city, with straight streets, leafless rows of trees, and a pace of life so slow, it seemed capable of soothing any mind. Nietzsche had written that he loved Turin, its light, its order, the sense of ease the city offered. On the surface, everything appeared fine, but inwardly, the intensity had gone too far. The letters from the end of 1888 no longer resembled ordinary correspondence. They read like fragments of revelation. Nietzsche signed his name with titles that no longer belonged to everyday life. Names symbolic, mythic, and increasingly detached from his personal self. Not because he was consciously pretending, but because the boundary between thought and person had grown perilously thin. Then came January the 3rd, 1889. The story has been told many times, with details never entirely specific, as with all moments that take on a legendary quality. On a street in Turin, Nietzsche saw a carriage driver whipping an old horse. The animal trembled, exhausted, unable to move forward. Nietzsche rushed toward it. He threw his arms around the horse's neck, and then he collapsed. There was no speech, no final declaration, only a body falling, as if all the accumulated intensity had converged in a single moment that could no longer be endured. From that instant on, Nietzsche was never the same. The days that followed passed in confusion. Nietzsche sent letters no longer anchored in reality. His close friend, Franz Overbeck, horrified by what he read, rushed to Turin. He found Nietzsche utterly broken, his mind oscillating between grand and agonizing images, Caesar, the conqueror, and Christ, the crucified, two opposing poles of power and sacrifice, two symbols that had haunted Nietzsche his entire life. Now they were no longer ideas. They tore his mind apart from within. The collapse in Turin was not a single moment of madness. It was the result of years lived in unrelenting intensity, a spirit that had continually dismantled every metaphysical support, while the body grew ever weaker. Nietzsche had demanded of humanity and of himself a capacity to affirm life to its furthest extreme. But biology has its limits. Here, a silence deserves to be respected. This collapse should not be romanticized. It was not the glorious price of genius. It was the tragedy of a human being who had gone too far in living truthfully with what he saw, and no longer had the strength to return. After Turin, Nietzsche lived for another 11 years, but they were 11 years of silence. He no longer wrote, no longer debated, no longer walked alone in the mountains. He lived under care, first by his mother, then by his sister, like a shadow of himself. For many, this is where the story ends. But for Nietzsche, perhaps this is the moment when all the most significant questions were handed over to the reader. For Nietzsche had completed his part. He had pushed philosophy to a place where it was no longer a safe discipline. He had turned it into a psychological experience, a test of human endurance. And when that test exceeded the limits of a single body, it did not become a failure. It became a warning. The collapse in Turin reminds us that staring directly into the abyss is not a game. Not everyone can emerge intact. And Nietzsche, the one who said this more clearly than anyone, paid with his own mental life. Yet something strange followed. Nietzsche's silence did not silence his ideas. On the contrary, when the human being stopped speaking, the words already written began to live on their own. They detached from their author. They were interpreted, distorted, used for purposes that Nietzsche, had he remained lucid, would likely have found repulsive. And here, another tragedy began. Not the tragedy of the body, but the tragedy of the legacy. In the next part, the penultimate stage of this journey, we will witness what happens when a thought no longer has its guardian, when power steps into the space left by silence, when a philosopher of the individual is transformed into a collective symbol. It is the story of a sister and a lie, and it is also the final question Nietzsche leaves us, not in words, but in absence. There is a kind of tragedy that does not occur while a person is alive. It unfolds after that person has lost the ability to defend themselves, when the voice has fallen silent, but the words remain and fall into someone else's hands. After the collapse in Turin, Nietzsche did not die immediately. He lived for another 11 years, but they were 11 years no longer belonging to the life of the mind we have just followed. The man who once walked alone in the mountains, who once wrote like prophecy, who once dared to pose eternal questions, now existed within a dense silence. He no longer wrote, no longer debated, no longer belonged to himself. His mind was like a room where the lights had gone out, while the body remained, like a thin shell. At first, his mother cared for him. It was a care shaped by old affection, gentle, anxious, and imbued with the religious tone of a family that had once believed deeply. But when his mother died, the right to care for him, and more importantly, the right to control, passed into the hands of his sister, Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche. And here, another story begins. not the story of a thinker seeking freedom, but the story of a legacy being seized. Elizabeth was not merely a sister, she was a will, an ambition, a person capable of seeing opportunity in her brother's very helplessness. Earlier, she had left Europe for Paraguay with her husband, dreaming of founding an Aryan colony, a project that failed and collapsed. When she returned, she carried within her a hunger that demanded compensation, the desire to stand at the center, to wield authority, to rewrite the story in a way that served her. And Nietzsche, immobile, unable to object, unable to explain, became the most excellent resource of all. This may sound cold, but that very coldness is the essence of the tragedy. For an intellectual legacy, when it lacks a guardian, it is always vulnerable to becoming a tool. An idea born to liberate the individual can be turned into a slogan to mobilize the masses. A voice that once opposed idols can be recast as a new idol. Elizabeth founded the Nietzsche Archive, organized documents, letters, and manuscripts, and gradually installed herself as the official interpreter. She did not merely manage papers. She managed how the world would understand Nietzsche. And when someone controls how another is understood, that is no longer administration. It is power. But power rarely stops at preservation. It usually takes one more step: construction. Elizabeth edited, cut, and rearranged unpublished manuscripts. Fragmentary notes, mere shards from a thinking process, were assembled into what appeared to be a systematic work, and from that arrangement emerged a notorious title: The Will to Power. The problem is not only that this book was never a finished work Nietzsche intended to publish. The problem is that it was shaped to serve a different narrative, one Elizabeth wished to tell. A Nietzsche easier to consume, easier to transform into a political symbol. A Nietzsche of raw power, of domination, of hierarchy, of superiority. This was a subtle betrayal. For the real Nietzsche, the Nietzsche of Zarathustra, of the hammer, of sounding out idols, never wished to become the banner of any collective movement. He distrusted crowds. He despised the uniformity of the spirit. He wanted no followers. He wanted each person to walk their own path. But Elizabeth did the opposite. She turned Nietzsche into something that could be collectivized. And when the 20th century entered the fever of nationalism and extremism, this distorted Nietzsche found a market hungry for symbols. Those seeking a philosophical foundation for power and violence were easily drawn to isolated quotations, ideas torn from context, and an image of Nietzsche displayed as a prophet of the will to dominate. A thinker of radical individuality transformed into the Shadowstar of collectivism. That is the most profound paradox of all. And within that paradox, we see a cold truth about the history of ideas. Powerful ideas always have two destinies. One is in the hands of honest readers. The other is their fate in the hands of those who wish to use them. Nietzsche warned against idols, things worshipped not because they are true, but because they are helpful in power. Yet he may never have imagined that his own name would become such an idol, erected upon his silence. Here the pain no longer lies with Nietzsche as an individual. It lies in the fact that a life that paid with solitude and collapse for the sake of spiritual freedom was ultimately bound again by a historical chain held by someone else. And the most tragic part is this: Nietzsche could not refute it. He could not write a single line to say, "No, that is not me." He could not defend himself against those who spoke in his name. Only the old pages remained, and a silent struggle over how they would be read. Yet even in that darkness there was a quiet light. Truth has endurance. It can be buried, but it does not vanish. It waits for patient hands to return to the original texts, for eyes sharp enough to distinguish between a voice and an echo. And so, after the Second World War, another effort began. Not loud, not dramatic, but meaningful like a rescue mission. Scholars returned to the real Nietzsche, peeled him away from interpretations that served power and restored what he had always wanted. A direct dialogue between writer and reader, without intermediaries. In the end, what Nietzsche left behind was not a system, not a doctrine, but a challenge. And that challenge will sound most clearly as we reach the final chapter, when Nietzsche's hammer is no longer held by those who distort, but returned to its proper place, as a tuning fork, lightly struck against the idols within ourselves. When a story reaches its final passage, history no longer needs to speak loudly. It lowers its voice, it slows down, and it offers no conclusion, only a question deep enough to follow us long after the end, after the long silence of Friedrich Nietzsche, after distortions, appropriations, and readings shaped by intent. The 20th century gradually began a quiet but decisive task, returning to the original texts, not to erect yet another idol, but to dismantle the idols that had been raised in his name. Scholars, most notably figures such as Walter Kaufmann, read Nietzsche not as a political prophet, not as a finished ideology, but as precisely what he always claimed to be: a challenger, a man who offered no answers but a method of suspicion. At the center of that method stands a famous image, one that is often misunderstood: the hammer. Nietzsche once wrote that he philosophized with a hammer. Many hear this and think of destruction, violence, extremism, smashing all, values to pieces. But that is a crude reading. Nietzsche's hammer was not meant to shatter the world. It was more like a tuning fork. He used the hammer to tap lightly on idols, those concepts, moralities, and beliefs regarded as sacred. If they rang hollow, it meant they no longer contained life within them. And when a value has become hollow, continuing to worship it is no longer morality, it is habit. This is the most subtle, and also the most unsettling, point of Nietzsche's legacy. He does not tell us to destroy everything. He asks only that we listen. Is this value still alive? Or are we holding on to it merely because we fear the emptiness that would appear if we let go? Nietzsche did not believe that human beings could live without values, but he did believe that values should not be inherited like antiques, nor preserved simply because it has always been this way. A value, if it is to deserve respect, must withstand the test of honesty. And for this reason, Nietzsche's final challenge is not directed at religion, nor at any particular moral code. It is directed at the reader. He does not ask, "What do you believe?" He asks, "What price are you willing to pay for what you believe?" For Nietzsche, belief is not measured by words, but by the way one lives. If a value can exist only when protected by the crowd, by laws, by punishment, then it is not a substantial value. It is a value that survives by fear. Nietzsche wanted something else. He wanted human beings strong enough to create the measure of their own lives, not to dominate others, but to avoid having their lives lived for them. When we look back across his entire journey, from the pastor's son in Röcken to the young scholar, the wanderer, the prophet, and finally the man who fell into silence, we see a single thread running through it all. Nietzsche never sought power over others. He sought something far more difficult, power that does not lie to itself. And, perhaps for this reason, His legacy can never become a closed doctrine. Every time someone tries to confine Nietzsche into this ism or that movement, he is immediately betrayed. Nietzsche lives only when he is read as an open dialogue, not as a creed. At the deepest level, Nietzsche's hammer does not strike God, morality, or history. It strikes the false comfort within each of us. It asks, are the things we believe truly our own, or are they merely borrowed shields to avoid facing our fear? This is also why Nietzsche never wanted disciples. Disciples seek reassurance. Nietzsche sought wakefulness. He did not promise that the path he pointed toward would make you happy. He promised only something harsher. If you go far enough, you will no longer deceive yourself. The final image, and perhaps the most truthful one, of Nietzsche is not the man embracing the horse in Turin, nor the thunderous prophet. It is the solitary walker in Sils Maria, moving slowly along a mountain path, carrying a wounded body and a mind that refused to submit. He did not leave behind a ready-made road. He did not say, "Follow me." He said only, "Dare to walk." And when the story closes, what remains is not Nietzsche as a historical figure. What remains is his challenge, quiet, enduring, and impossible to ignore. Are you living by values that are genuinely your own, or by idols you have never dared to tap and test? The hammer has been placed in the reader's hand. Nietzsche has finished his part. What remains is your silence and what you choose to do within it.